This week, we want to finish up our look, first of all, of the diencephalon by looking at the subthalamus and the hypothalamus. And then from there, I want to move up into the telencephalon and talk a little bit about the basal ganglia. First of all, as we look at the subthalamus, we're going to see that this area is going to be one of the two areas that is underneath, or if you like, ventral to the thalamus. And so when we look at the boundaries associated with the subthalamus, above we are going to see the thalamus. And the thalamus, again, is a very, very large structure, but it's a very, very nice boundary line for us. And then from there, we're going to see on the lateral edge down through here, we're going to see the internal capsule. And the internal capsule is going to be both the lateral boundary, but then it's going to wrap around and become the ventral boundary or the inferior boundary also. So we're going to see that the internal capsule is going to serve as both the lateral and the ventral or inferior boundary. Then medially, we are going to see this area right here, and this is going to be the hypothalamus. So, as we look at the boundaries associated with our subthalamus, we're going to see the superior or the dorsal boundary is going to be the thalamus. We are going to see the lateral and inferior ventral boundary, the internal capsule. Medial boundary is going to be the hypothalamus. When we look at the subthalamus, we are going to see that, first of all, it is going to be made up of two groups of cell bodies. The first of these, and the larger of the two, is the subthalamic nucleus. And the subthalamic nucleus is going to be that area that is going to really be the major component of this area. And the subthalamus is going to be considered to be an upward extension of the substantia nigra. And so the subthalamic nucleus is going to be a motor system controller. The second area associated with the subthalamus is an area colored in green here, which is called the zona incerta. The zona incerta gets its name because it is actually inserted in between the thalamus and the subthalamic nucleus. And this is one of many thirst centers in the central nervous system, in that this area is going to be monitoring the blood for viscosity, temperature, various concentrations of compounds, and it will then let us know whether or not we are thirsty. So, two groups of cell bodies. We are going to see the subthalamic nucleus, and then we are going to see the zona incerta. Then from there, we're going to see three groups of axons. Our first axon area is going to be in between the zona incerta and the subthalamic nucleus. And this area is called the lenticular fasciculus. The lenticular fasciculus, along with the other axon areas, were described by a man named Farrell. And so in the old terminology, these axon tracts used to be called the fields of Farrell. Nowadays, we call them by a different name based on what they connect. So the lenticular fasciculus in Farrell's time was called the H2 field. And this is the connection of the subthalamus to the basal ganglia. Our second area is going to be a small little area right here. And this area, in Farrell's terminology, used to be called the H field. But today it is called the prerubral field. And the prerubral field is the connection of the subthalamus to the cerebellum. And then finally, we're going to have an area that is in between the zona incerta and the thalamus. And this area in Farrell's time was called the H1 field. And today we call this the thalamic fasciculus. The thalamic fasciculus is considered to be the continuation of the union of the prerubral fasciculus and the lenticular fasciculus. In other words, what I'm saying is that if this is the prerubral fasciculus, if this represents the lenticular fasciculus, these two meet to form the thalamic fasciculus. And the thalamic fasciculus will connect to VA and VL of the thalamus, which you'll remember were the motor nuclei of the thalamus. So, as we look at this area, we're going to see that the subthalamus is made up of two groups of cell bodies: the subthalamic nucleus for motor system control and the zona incerta for thirst. And then we're going to have three areas of axons: a connection to the basal ganglia, a connection to the cerebellum, and then a connection to the thalamus. The last area I want to talk about in conjunction with the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. And what you want to do in the back of your mind is always think about the hypothalamus as being one of those areas that control our basal life functions. So when we look at the hypothalamus, first of all, like we've done with many areas of the diencephalon, we want to define this area. So we're going to say that the anterior boundary is going to be the lamina terminalis. We are going to see that the dorsal boundary is going to be the hypothalamic sulcus. Posterior boundary is going to be the midbrain. And then across the ventral surface, we are going to see three different structures. We are going to see the optic chiasm. We are going to see the infundibulum, or pituitary stalk, and we are going to see the mammillary body. From here, we can look at a sagittal view of the hypothalamus and identify the nuclei that make up this area of the central nervous system. And what we are going to do is we're going to divide these nuclei into four groups. And this will just help us with bookkeeping and so that we can talk about these nuclei. So from anterior to posterior, our first group of nuclei is called the preoptic group. And for us, we are going to say that the preoptic group of nuclei is made up of one nucleus. And this is the preoptic nucleus. The preoptic nucleus rests right up against the lamina terminalis. And this is going to be another thirst center associated with our central nervous system. The next area is called the supraoptic area. The supraoptic group of nuclei is named because these nuclei are going to stack up right above the optic chiasm. And when we look at this area, we are going to see four nuclei. The first of these is going to be the paraventricular nucleus. This nucleus is named because of the fact that it's right up against the third ventricle. This nucleus is associated with oxytocin. And oxytocin is a hormone that is going to cause the muscle of the uterus to contract during childbirth. Then, underneath of that, we are going to have the anterior nucleus. The anterior nucleus works with the preoptic nucleus, in that this is also a thirst center. So in the world of anatomy, these are two unique structures. But in the world of physiology, they really work as one. Then we have the supraoptic nucleus. The supraoptic nucleus is associated with the hormone ADH, which is going to be a hormone that is going to affect the kidney and the concentration of urine. And then finally, we have the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is a small nucleus right above the optic chiasm. And this is going to control circadian rhythms. And so you'll remember when we talked about the pineal gland, we saw that the pineal gland is going to be associated with the control of circadian rhythms, but it shuts down. Well, in the human, it is the suprachiasmatic nucleus that is going to be the major nucleus in the functioning of circadian rhythms. Then, as I move posteriorly, my next group of nuclei are called the tubral group of nuclei. The tubral group of nuclei are named because these are going to stack up right above the infundibulum. 3 nuclei are found with this group. First of all, I'm going to identify the ventral medial nucleus. This nucleus is going to be for both hunger and rage. And so this is the major nucleus that is going to be associated with the hunger response. But it is also a rage center. And so we can see a relationship between hunger and rage because these are controlled by the same nucleus. Above that, we're going to have the dorsal medial nucleus. This nucleus is going to go in the books as function unknown. And then finally, right above the infundibulum, we're going to see the arcuate nucleus. The arcuate nucleus, first of all, is going to be associated with ACTH. And this is a hormone that is going to affect the adrenal gland. But also, this nucleus is going to be associated with opioid molecules. And so therefore, we are going to say that this is going to be a pleasure center. And then finally, our last group of nuclei are going to be the mammillary group. The mammillary group of nuclei made up of 2 different nuclei. The first and the largest of these is the mammillary nucleus. And this is how the hypothalamus is going to communicate to higher centers of the brain through the mammillothalamic tract to the thalamus and the fornix, which is going to go to the limbic system. And also it is made up of a posterior nucleus. And this is how the hypothalamus is going to communicate to lower centers of the central nervous system. So as you are working with this, make sure that you know where these nuclei are and just a brief discussion about what they do associated with these basal functions.